was Robert Stephen Hawker?
Robert Stephen Hawker, Hawker of Morwenstow. Who was he? Well, among other things, he wrote the words of the song you have just been hearing, the Song of the Western Men, and Shall Trelawny Die, often called Cornwall's national anthem. He was Vicar of Morwenstow from 1834 until his death in 1875, and he is chiefly remembered now as an eccentric, a man who behaves strangely, a man of whom funny stories are told, a joke figure. And this, to those of us who cherish his memory, is distressing, because he was so much more. A priest, a mystic, a poet, a Cornishman. He did rather ask for it, this reputation as an eccentric, a funny man. When still a boy, living in Stratton, where his father was curate, he became quite renowned for his practical jokes.
He dressed up as a mermaid and sat out on a rock in Bude Bay, singing and combing his locks and attracting quite a crowd, until a farmer took a pot shot at him, and he thought he might be safer to swim ashore.
Another time he painted the doctor's horse in black and white stripes, and then arranged for him to have to gallop through the town on an urgent call.
On the other hand, there was a poor illiterate old shopkeeper who was due to be turned out by his landlord, who told him to put a notice in the window offering the place to let. He asked young Hawker to compile a notice for him, explaining he did not want to go. And Hawker wrote,
"This house to let, both cold and wet. In it you'll find no ease. In winter you'll be froze to death, in summer eat by fleas."
all good clean fun. And as he grew older, he never altogether changed. Most conspicuously, he dressed very strangely indeed. He strongly disapproved of the black clothes normally associated with clergymen.
I don't let myself look like an unemployed undertaker.
He wore instead a long brown cassock, a fisherman's jersey, sea boots up to the thigh, and a brown wide-brimmed hat. Much of this was symbolic. He was very keen on symbols, as a way of emphasizing his strong Christian faith. For instance, the fisherman's jersey was meant to be a reminder of the instruction of Jesus to his disciples to be fishers of men. Woven into one side of it was a small red cross,
Marking the entrance of the centurion's cruel spear at the crucifixion.
The colour of his cassock was
The exact hue of Our Lady's hair, and her blessed Son's, that of a ripe chestnut with the sun trembling over it.
He confidently claimed this kind of intimate knowledge of Jesus and his family, and, as we shall see, of angels, and indeed of devils.
Such a curiously dressed figure, striding round his huge parish, boldly proclaiming his Christian witness in an unusual way, was bound to be regarded as out of the ordinary, eccentric.
He also loved telling a good story and wasn't too worried about how true it was. A very prim and proper lady visitor reported, "He was a brilliant storyteller, a bit wayward mind, and then there's another thing about Robert Stephen Hawker, which he made people think he was eccentric. He loved his animals, and he liked his cats to come to church with him. His pet pig called Jip followed him everywhere, just like a dog. A friend described the behaviour of his pet stag."
The vicar had a great aversion to low church clergymen, and told me that his stag Robin, who ranged on the lawn, had the same, and that once he pinned one of them to the ground between his horns. The poor man cried out in great fear, so the vicar told Robin to let him go, which he did, and stood and looked at the obnoxious individual as if he would like to have him down again and frighten him. Though he would not hurt him, Robin was kind-hearted.
So let us next look at Robert Stephen Hawker, the priest, the Vicar of Morwenstow. When he came to Morwenstow with his wife Charlotte in 1834, He was the first resident vicar for over 100 years, and the place was poverty-stricken and sadly neglected. He described his parish and his parishioners.
My seaward boundary was a stretch of bold and rocky shore, an interchange of lofty headland and sudden gorge, the cliffs from 300 to 450 feet of perpendicular and gradual height, and the valleys gushing with torrents, which bounded rejoicingly towards the sea and leaped at last amid a cloud of spray into the waters. So stern and pitiless is the iron-bound coast, that in the memory of one man, upwards of 80 wrecks have been counted within a reach of 15 miles, with only here and there the rescue of a living man. Here my days were to glide away, afar from the noise and bustle of the world. My people were a mixed multitude of smugglers, wreckers, and dissenters of various hue.
Dissenters of various hue, the name Ocher used for all they there nonconformist. He couldn't abide 'em, though at a personal level a number of his friends and most loyal members of his congregation were also dissenters, quietly attending church in the morning and going to chapel in the afternoon.
What worried him was what he took to be the Methodist doctrine, that the church was unnecessary and each individual could deal directly with his or her Maker. John Wesley himself had written,
It requires of its members no conformity, either in opinions or modes of worship, but barely this one thing, to fear God and work righteousness.
Hawker took the matter at least one stage further.
Methodism. A man's own feelings save him. It is salvation made easy, or every man his own redeemer.
To him, as a loyal and militant Anglican, dissenters were a threat. Whatever the rights and wrongs here, he soon made himself more constructively busy, improving the state of his impoverished parish. First, he built a bridge in the Coombe Valley on what was then the main road to Bude and Stratton, over the stream which reaches the sea at Duckpool, in which many men and cattle had drowned over the years. It is called King William's Bridge, because William IV, at the vicar's request, contributed £20 to its cost. But Hawker himself and his wife bore much of the rest.
This is just one example of his instant generosity, which posed problems for him as his life went on. His son-in-law and biographer Charles Byles writes,
He was too lavish, too generous, doing everything as he considered it ought to be done, and never pausing to reflect whether he could afford it. But while this principle was fatal to himself, there is no doubt that it was very beneficial to the parish.
In this spirit, he went on to build the school in the hamlet called Shop in the middle of his scattered parish.
I called it St. Mark's, because he was not an apostle but teacher only, and is called in olden times the children's saint.
Under his care, St. Mark's School flourished. In 1975, the centenary of his death, a booklet was printed of poems written by the children. They included this couplet by Kingsley Bryant.
Our school was built in the form of a cross, for Reverend Ocher was the boss.
Still every year, on the patronal festival of St. John the Baptist, the children of St. Mark's School walk in procession to the church for a service at which Hawker's hymn is sung, the song of the school.
also reclaimed and preserved for Morwenstow a piece of its history, the 13th century Holy Well of St. John, which stands in a pretty orchard close to the church. Water for baptism, the sacrament which Hawker held especially dear, is still drawn from the well and carried to the church. He described his achievement.
The well and the ground whereon it stands, having been unlawfully claimed by Sir John Buller, the right of the church was sustained by the present vicar, and after a lawsuit which lasted 2 whole days, wherein all that wealth and rank and power could accomplish were brought to bear against the church, a triumphant verdict in the vicar's favour was returned with costs.
Triumphant indeed, and there was much rejoicing when the vicar returned from the assizes in Bodmin, with the church bells ringing, flags flying, and the choir singing their heads off at the top of the tower.
He was responsible for the creation of another building, a very small one, the most personal of them all. Hawker's Hut, as it has come to be called, built of driftwood, standing out on the cliffs and commanding a magnificent view to the rocks below and across the sea. Here he would go every day, sometimes with Charlotte, sometimes alone, to read and write letters and poetry, to watch anxiously in rough weather as ships passed, fearful that they might be forced towards the cruel black reefs beneath him. Above all, perhaps, to commune with the sea. John Betjeman described him as
a magnificent sea poet, a poet of storms and crises.
He himself expressed his passionate involvement with the sea in a poem called The Storm.
War mid the ocean and the land, the battlefield Morwenna's strand, where rock and ridge the bulwark keep, the giant warders of the deep. They come, and shall they not prevail? The seething surge, the gathering gale, they fling their wild flag to the breeze, the banner of 1,000 seas. They come, they mount, they charge in vain. Thus far incalculable main, no more. Thine hosts have not o'erthrown the lichen on the barrier stone. Mark where they writhe in pride and shame, fierce valour and the zeal of fame. Hear how their din of madness raves, the baffled army of the waves. Thy way, O God, is in the sea, thy paths where awful waters be. Thy spirit thrills the conscious stone. O Lord, thy footsteps are not known.
He built the vicarage, having first noticed where sheep took refuge in a storm. The chimneys are its most unusual feature, 3 of them representing the towers of Cornish churches where he had worked, Stratton, Whitstone and North Tamerton, and a 4th, the chapel tower of his Oxford College. He wrote a poem which is inscribed over the front door.
A house, a glebe, a pound a day, a pleasant place to watch and pray. Be true to church, be kind to poor, O minister, for evermore.
There is another memorable element of Hawker's ministry, a very dramatic one, his involvement with shipwrecks and shipwrecked sailors, dead or alive, mostly dead.
There lies a cold corpse upon the sands, down by the rolling sea. Close up the eyes and straighten the hands, as a Christian man's should be. Bury it deep for the good of my soul, 6 feet below the ground. Let the sexton come and the death bell toll, and good men stand around. Lay it among the churchyard stones, where the priest has blessed the clay. I cannot leave the unburied bones, and I fain would go my way.
Hawker describes the scene of the wreck of the Caledonia in 1842.
The vessel, a brig of 500 tons, had struck, as we afterwards found, at 3 o'clock that morning. and by the time the wreck was discovered, she had been shattered into broken pieces by the fury of the sea. The rocks on the water bristled with fragments of mast and spar and rent timbers. The cordage lay about in tangled masses. The rollers tumbled in masses of corn, the wheaten cargo, and amidst it all the bodies of the helpless dead that a few brief hours before had walked the deck, the stalwart masters of their ship, turned their poor disfigured faces towards the sky, pleading for burial.
It was just after midnight on the 13th of September 1869 when Captain Caulfield dropped both anchors just off Sharpnose Point in a vain attempt to keep the Avonmore off the rocks. She was carrying coal from Cardiff to Montevideo with a crew of 22 on board. She was crippled by a northwest violent storm. Her anchors dragged and most of her sails were ripped to pieces. There were very high waves with long overhanging crests. The resulting foam was blown in dense white streaks along the direction of the wind, and foam and driving spray made visibility practically nil. Her topsails were already reefed, and the only sails left were her storm staysails. At daybreak, the pitiful cries of the sailors could be heard over the sound of the roaring sea. The rocket brigade was soon on the scene. A rocket line was fired and secured, but a heavy sea breaking over the ship washed overboard the mate and 6 members of the crew who were trying to cut away the standing rigging. All were drowned. Of the remaining, 1 sailor was seen to be jammed under a fallen mast. A courageous Dr. King of Stratton went out to the ship in the breeches buoy with the intention of amputating the man's leg. Fortunately, with help, it was possible to move the fallen mast, and this man and the rest of the crew were eventually saved.
For all concerned, 'twas a grim business. Before Hawker's time, the people of Morwenstow and other villages on the coast of Cornwall welcomed shipwrecks, because they provided a sudden and exciting relief from the grinding poverty which bedevilled their lives. They would take and keep the cargo that was washed ashore, and us have to face the fact that in some cases they used to make sure that there were no survivors who would have a first claim to the salvage.
It's one of Hawker's great achievements that he brought those days of wrecking and brutal murder firmly and finally to an end, at least along this stretch of coastline. As a visible witness to the wreck of the Caledonia and many other ships, her figurehead now stands in Morwenstow churchyard, and close around it lie buried the bodies of over 40 sailors, victims of the many shipwrecks with which Hawker had to deal.
Stand, silent image, stately stand, where sighs shall breathe and tears be shed, and many a heart of Cornish land will soften for the stranger dead. They came in pass of storm, they found this quiet home in Christian ground.
When a wreck was reported, Hawker would gather a party of men and go down to the shore to collect the dead bodies, often torn to pieces by the rocks onto which the sea had flung them. They would carry them up to the church and give them Christian burial. Hawker made it very clear that nothing by way of cargo on the shore was to be touched until this act of mercy had been performed. So his life was far from a gentle, uneventful existence in a quiet country parish. He was often under substantial strain. But he found great peace of mind in his spiritual life, and especially in the closeness he felt to angels, particularly his guardian angel and the angel of Morwenstow Church.
But for much of the time, particularly in the 1850s, he was far from happy. He was often ill himself, and the health of his wife Charlotte was a proper worry to him. Above all, he was lonely and frustrated, feeling that the world was passing him by, stranded as he was in his remote parish.
I have lived on among these faraway rocks, unprofited, unpraised and unknown.
He had known distinction as a young man. At Oxford University he won the Newdigate Poetry Prize. His two closest friends there had both become bishops, and he must have craved for the same level of achievement, though with his unusual personality and ideas he cannot ever have been in the running. He actually achieved far more in his career than most parish priests. For example, he became well known as one of the first to hold a special harvest festival service. In 1843, he announced to his parishioners,
Brethren, God has been merciful to us this year also. He has opened his hand and filled all things living with plenteousness. Let us gather together in the chancel of our church, and there receive, in the bread of the new corn, that blessed sacrament which was ordained to strengthen and refresh our souls.
Harvest Festival is now an established and popular custom in the church. Moreover, in his capacity as rural dean of Trigg Major, he was the first person ever to call a rural synod, an annual meeting of all the clergy in the area. He addressed them in Morwenstow Church, describing the place that he loved in vivid terms.
The solemn roof which now bends over us, the image of that invisible shelter which has been our refuge from one generation to another, that single sacred font, the memorial that we have all been baptized into one body by one Spirit, the simple and solitary altar at which, century after century, so many ministers have said the same thing, the silence of these ancient aisles that have grown old with the worship of past generations, all these are so many pledges to me of the propriety of our thought and language, here where we come to take sweet counsel together and to walk in the house of God as friends.
But none of these achievements can have satisfied a man who, when young, had seemed to have the world at his feet. He was particularly unhappy that his writings had failed to bring him fame or even profit.
All this has been the result of my remote and secluded abode here among the rocks, and also that I have never had friends. In my whole struggle into manuscript, I hardly remember a word of encouragement. Every one of my compositions has been forthwith sold, but for no advantage of mine. And here I am at the close of my days, unnoted, unknown, and worst of all, unpaid.
Yes, he loved Morwenstow, but sometimes its remoteness seems to have driven him almost mad. His wife Charlotte was his prop and stay through these troubled times. They had married when he was still at Oxford. She was 20 years older than he. For 40 years they had supported one another, and when she died in 1863, he was shattered with grief. In his sorrow, he was inspired to write his marvellous poem, The Quest of the Sandgrau.
He was telling the story about the legends of King Arthur, the search which the Knights of the Round Table set out upon, the search for the Holy Grail, the cup from which Jesus drank at the Last Supper. He had been absorbed by the story for much of his life. He and Charlotte had spent their honeymoon at Tintagel, which he always called by its old name, Dundagel.
There we used to roam about and read all that could be found about those old world histories. And often was this legend of the Sandgrau talked of as a fine subject for verse. Often I have said, if I could but throw myself back to King Arthur's time and write what he would have said and thought, It would make a good Cornish book.
He was further inspired by the visit he received in 1848 from Alfred Tennyson, who was already planning his version of Arthur's story, Idylls of the King. The two poets got on well, and when The Quest was published, Hawker was delighted to hear Tennyson's generous comment, "Hawker has beaten me on my own ground." Certainly the two versions of the story are very different. Hawker's is very much a Cornish poem. He comments himself,
"It is monumental Morwenstow throughout. I have touched on every Cornish feature in existence, our rock altars, barrows, moors."
He celebrates the Celtic saints who brought Christianity to Cornwall and gave their names to so many places, including St. Morwenstow.
They had their lodges in the wilderness, or built themselves beside the shadowy sea, and there they dwelt with angels like a dream.
And in the last lines that he completed of the Quest, perhaps the finest lines he ever wrote, he describes the sea at Tintagel.
He ceased, and all around was dreamy night. There stood Tintagel, throned, and the great sea lay, a strong vessel at his master's gate, and like a drunken giant sobbed in sleep.
Arthur, the Cornish king, joyfully praises his native land and then plunges into misery, very like his creator, Robert Stephen Hawker, who was clearly an example of what we now call a manic depressive.
Ah, native Cornwall, throned upon the hills, thy moorland pathways worn by angel feet, thy streams that march in music to the sea, mid ocean's merry noise, his billowy laugh. Ah me, a gloom hangs heavy on my soul. The birds that sung to me in youth are dead. I think, in dreamy vigils of the night, it may be God is angry with my land.
Hawker speaks through Arthur. His beloved wife has just died. He has no children. Life seems to have passed him by. He retains one single hope.
I have no son, no daughter of my loins, to breathe mid future men their father's name. My blood will perish when these veins are dry. Yet am I fain some deeds of mine should live. I would not be forgotten in this land.
But in 1863, the year of the quest of the San Graal, he still had 12 years to live, and they were eventful years. Most regrettably, he wrote no more of the quest, although he was only a quarter of the way through it. He became preoccupied with something entirely different.
At the age of 60, he fell in love with a young lady of 20, and she, Pauline Kusenski, fell in love with him, even though, after their first meeting, she wrote to her uncle,
"Mr. Hawker, our vicar, is slightly cracked, but he's a very clever old soul."
In no time at all, this very clever old soul was on his way to London to meet her no doubt astonished mother and seek Pauline's hand in marriage. He travelled by train for only the second time and met with adventures.
He leaned out of the window and his hat blew off, so he pulled the emergency cord and brought the train to a standstill. He was very mad when the authorities, far from offering to get him back his hat, told him he shouldn't have pulled the cord. At the next stop, which was Salisbury, he summoned the station master and said, "I want a new hat." He was told railway stations do not supply hats, and he remarked, "Bless my soul, what a benighted place this is."
One way and another, he retained through his life a capacity for surprising people. He and Pauline married, and they had 3 daughters who brought him great happiness in his old age, but also anxiety, because he had always been short of money, and now he had a young family to support.
On his deathbed in Plymouth in August 1875, a Catholic priest was summoned and he was received into the Catholic Church. It is difficult for us to understand now the consternation that this caused. Hawker was actually well known, and the controversy between the two churches, Roman Catholic and Anglican, about his conversion reached national proportions and dragged on for years. In Anglican circles, Pauline, who was not herself a Catholic at the time, was blamed for making the decision for him when he was too ill to make it himself, and this made her most unhappy. For those whom he left behind, it was a distressing end to his life.
None of this should any longer matter. Plenty of people will say it should not have mattered at the time. Now we can all wholeheartedly rejoice in the life and work of this great man, the eccentric and wit, with his practical jokes and his delight in storytelling, the priest who loved and cared for his people, fought to keep them out of the workhouse, and gave Christian burial to shipwrecked sailors, the mystic who talked to angels in his church, and the poet and the Cornishman, author of The Quest of the Sandgrowl, who beat Alfred Tennyson on his own ground, author of that splendid patriotic Cornish song, Trelawny, a man of God for whose life we are thankful.